And there was actually one time. Worse than the ones on the president last year. Get out some of it.
I think we can go. Yeah.
That's not hard.
All right, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker today for our Len Robach speaker series. So today's speaker is our nominated Len Robach speaker at the Department of Atmospheric Oceanic Sciences, as an opportunity every year to bring in, through the generous support from the Len Robach family that supports this speaker series, along with a couple other of events in our department. So as you have all seen in the announcements and hopefully have registered, this is one of two talks, right? So today, Asmeret Asefaw Berhe will talk a little bit about her work in soil biogeochemistry and the role of precipitation in soil carbon. And then stick around for part two tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in WID for a bigger picture talk, not just on soils and carbon, but kind of how that fits into the climate system and how that fits into Asmeret's career and all of the ways that we think about our Earth system as a whole. And we have tons of really good food in the reception afterwards. Like last year we had too much food, so you have to come and help us eat it. So please come tomorrow night and we'll hear part two. But before we start with the talk today, I'll just do a quick introduction. So Asmeret Berhe is a professor of soil biogeochemistry and the Falasco Chair in Earth Science and Geology at the Department of Life and Environmental Sciences at University of California, Merced. Her research interest lies at the intersection of soil science, geochemistry, global change science, and political ecology, and she seeks to improve how soil systems regulate Earth's climate and the dynamic two-way relationship between soils and humans. She received her bachelor's degree in soil and water conservation from the University of Asmeret in Eritrea, a master's degree in political ecology from Michigan State. And you can ask her what political ecology means. It's an interesting interdisciplinary subfield. And a PhD in biogeochemistry from UC Berkeley. After that, she was the President's Postdoc Fellow, joint with UC Davis in Berkeley, and then joined the faculty at UC Merced, plus or minus a few other detours along your way. And most recently, from 2022 to 2024, she served as the Director of Science, Director of the Office of Science for the U.S. Department of Energy. She is also a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union, where we both share the Joanne Simpson Medal, and a Fellow of the Geological Society of America, and a member of the inaugural class of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine's New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. But to me, Asmeret is a colleague and friend and part of our Carbon Cycle crew, along with serving alongside with me as an associate editor of the Journal of Geophysical Biogeosciences for 3 years. And there was no soil biogeochemistry paper I could assign that was too challenging for her to handle. For that, is what I am most appreciative of. So thank you very much for being here. It's great to see you again.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me well? Cool. Really excited to be back at Madison. It's been a few years since I was here, so really excited to be here, join you. Thank you, Ankur and the department, for the honor and invitation. Really excited to join you all today. So today I decided to do something a little different than what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. I figured a group of mostly atmospheric scientists, I wanted to talk at least about the implications of change in atmospheric processes in the way me as a soil biogeochemist sees them, in particular what it means with changing precipitation patterns. And we'll talk about a variety of studies that my lab has been doing in the recent past. I won't go too far without giving credit where it's due, in particular students and postdocs that have worked in my lab over the years that are responsible for all the wonderful work that you'll see today. If there's any criticism or blame, I'll take it, but all the credit, they take it. And also a wonderful group of collaborators and other folks who've supported us and funding from multiple agencies at this point. Okay. So I wanted us to talk about biogeochemical implications of the changing precipitation regimes. And I'm going to take you a little bit on a cruise across the state of California, if you will. Because we want to think about the precipitation change in the context of climate change and take kind of sampling, if you will, work that we've done in 4 parts of the state. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about work that we did at UC Davis to think about short-term responses or to change in water availability, i.e. wetting, and what happens to temperature sensitivity of CO2, in particular during wet up and drying phases in very, very short, relatively speaking, periods of time. Then we go to Mendocino, where we've had a 20-year rainfall addition experiment to think about what happens in ecosystem processes, in particular soil carbon and organic matter dynamics after precipitation changes. And then we go up the hill, the Sierra Nevada, in central Sierra Nevada in particular, to talk about extreme rapid drying that happened in high elevation meadow ecosystems and its implications for carbon cycling. And then lastly, we'll go through the southern part of the Sierra Nevada to talk about how changes in precipitation regulate lateral distribution of organic matter, i.e. erosion, and its implications for fate of that transported organic matter. So, of course, I think we're all on the same page here, so I won't belabor these points, generally speaking, in this audience. But, of course, precipitation patterns are changing, and what we're seeing around the country and around the world is that some places are getting wet, others are getting dry. Some are experiencing both at different times of the year. Some places are seeing quite extreme changes in precipitation. And those extreme shifts in precipitation towards more hot weather and even more record hot weather have come with periods of heavy precipitation and some less light precipitation that are expected, that are being expected and observed in many parts of the country and the world right now, including in the state of California. And so why do I care about this? I care about this because precipitation patterns are regulate hydrology and hydrologic flow regimes in soil, which are tightly coupled with biogeochemical cycling of essential elements. And as I say this, think about the fact that soil water is so central to regulating a number of key processes, right? But ultimately, how much water is in soil, its water status, if you will depend on a variety of state factors, including climate, topography, vegetation, disturbance, of what type of soil conditions we're talking about. And generally speaking, soil water is a tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of water that exists on the Earth system, right? But it has disproportionately large implication for a number of key processes in soil that many of them feed back with organic matter dynamics. So soil affects a variety of soil processes, including in the long term, to what extent biogeochemical and physical weathering processes can take place, which has an implication for how much organic matter you can accumulate, how much biota you can support, a variety of nutrient cycling, energy balance, fluid flows, and many, many other critical ecosystem processes. Hence, even though soil water is such a tiny fraction of water, we care about it so much because of all these roles that it has. Okay, so as I said, we'll start with the study in UC Davis, which is a profile scale observation of what happens to CO2 concentration and fluxes during wetting and drying of soil. So to do this, this was set up, this experiment was set up when Johan Six was at UC Davis, and I was in his lab right before I started in Merced, and went on for a while. But the kind of snippet that I will show you here is basically this instrumented set of pits at the student farm at UC Davis, where 3 pits A, B, C were kind of taken as representatives. And what's happening basically in these pits is that there is an excavated site right in the middle where it says soil pit here, right? And the reason why this pit is located here, but we're monitoring these sites, is to avoid the direct disturbance to these soils. So laterally though, these tubes were sent down to where the observed soil pits are, so that we can record a variety of variables, including soil temperature, soil moisture, and CO2, oxygen sensors, and a whole bunch of other sensors. So all of them were placed along this depth profile, all the way from 15 centimeter to 90 centimeter. There were also observations made of the surface that we're not going to talk about today. but they're all taken at the same time, and so they will allow us to kind of think about this short-term response. This was all in a system that was historically cultivated, but was left bare during the experiment to avoid basically new organic matter from entering the data that we were collecting. Mediterranean climate, UC Davis, as I mentioned, and pretty poorly weathered soil, so endosols is what we're talking about here. Poorly weathered soil, and the way we kind of did this is as low-tech as it gets. We had drip irrigation tapes and basically applied about 18.2 centimeters per day of water during the wet up period, and then just sat back and observed what happened as it dried over time. And so this is what we're talking about, just the responses here with volumetric water content, temperature, soil temperature, and diffusivity at all the different depths that we're seeing. So basically where you see the wiggles are where the surface responses are. There's large immediate responses to wetting that happen in the beginning in all cases. And the fastest responses are associated with surface or close to the surface layers, and deeper soil layers don't respond as much, and their responses are more dampened. Nothing groundbreaking in what I showed you right now. Okay, and this is the response in CO2 concentrations that you saw. Again, the biggest wiggles that you will see are with the surface or close to the surface layers, 15 centimeter, and the more dampened ones are at depth. And what we're seeing here is basically that the CO2 concentration at these different layers quickly responded, of course, to the wetting, and it took a while to dry over time, as you see here. And the change in CO2 concentration here can be explained with change in microbial respiration that drove these patterns, especially in the topsoil layers. Part of this is what's known as Birch effect, where CO2 effluxes in dry soils increase very quickly upon wetting, because the microbial cells in particular that are exposed to this sudden change experience osmotic stress, and there's lysis and death and rather quick respiration, decomposition that would happen. And then the other thing you want to think about, in particular, this mechanism is important in soils that have a lot of organic matter, but to some extent even valuable here, is that when you have higher water content, it enables a physical connection, if you will, from organic matter that's in soil and to the microbes that can break it down. So think about the fact that sometimes there is a physical separation of where organic matter is and where the water in soil is and where the microbes that could actually decompose the organic matter are. When you start wetting soil, you kind of try to create a conduit where all those things get connected, the microbes, the water, and the organic matter. And that in many systems has been shown to facilitate rather fast decomposition. And if I just kind of plotted the relative change in CO2 concentration per change in temperature that's occurring, the green dots, pretty kind of close to zero all around, is aimed at ambient conditions, and then the blue are during wetting, and the red is during drying. And you see quite different kind of patterns, in particular at deep soil layers, to changes in temperature, right? So the CO2 concentrations along the depth profile, as you see, is actually more sensitive during wetting than it is during drying, and deep soil organic matter tends to be way more sensitive to changes in this moisture availability in both cases than in some cases even the very top layer. And this is partly because, of course, the surface soil layer are more used to seeing that fluctuation. You remember the wiggles in the data that is there. So small shifts here and there are not going to necessarily lead to even more fluctuation. But in deep soil layers where the fluctuations in temperature and moisture are normally dampened, when you introduce these fluctuations, you see a much bigger response. Okay. Switch gears a little bit again and go to Mendocino County up north. Way more developed soils, way more organic matter in soil. These are Mediterranean grasslands. And this is where I mentioned we had a 20-year rainfall addition experiment, a manipulation, if you will. Also a Mediterranean ecosystem, a meadow in a river terrace at the southern fork of the Eel River in California is where the study took place. And these are, as I mentioned, more developed soils. So alpha soils, Altic alpha soils in particular, for those of you who this makes sense to, which means they have a lot more iron oxides in soil, and pretty well developed soil. They're deep, they're really well drained. Mostly these ecosystems historically had native perennial grasslands and some native forbs and exotic or annual grasses. So in response to modeling results that occurred especially, kind of about in the last, in the 90s, near the end of the 1990s and early 2000, this study was set up to mimic the results of especially two of the models, the Canadian model and the Hadley model. So both of these models had predicted that in California, in particular in the western part of the US, there would be increased precipitation, but they disagreed on when that increased precipitation would occur. Whether that increased precipitation would occur during the already wet winter season in this type of ecosystems, or whether it would be extend the rainy season into the late spring and early summer months. And from an ecological standpoint, that makes a lot of difference for plant growth. So the study and this was set up basically to investigate the ecological implications of this. And the way it was done is another kind of low-tech effort, if you will. Those circular plots were established, each about 70 meters square, and then sprinklers were used to apply the water. And the water was collected from rainfall that occurred slightly up the hill from where this grassland is, and just applied to make sure that we're not introducing any ions and things that were not there. So a randomized plot design here to distribute the plots. Some of these plots were just left as they are, ambient rainfall. Some of the plots, a third of them, where water was added 20% above ambient during the winter. The other third, 20% above ambient precipitation was added to extend the rainy season into the late spring and summer months. So this is kind of basically showed you, the purple plots here show you where that additional precipitation had happened in accordance with the Hadley model or the Canadian model. So this would be the winter addition treatment, and this is the spring addition treatment. Okay. So I started this work a long time ago when I was a postdoc at Berkeley. So this was data that was collected at the time to demonstrate how this was only about a little less than 6 years after the experiment was started, to see, is there change in soil carbon? Frankly, we started this experiment not really thinking we'd see any change. 5 years, about 20% additional precipitation, did not really think it's gonna matter as much for soil carbon. Well, we were not actually correct in that assumption. It turned out, especially in the spring addition, where the additional water was used to extend the rainy season into spring and summer months, there was a lot more carbon in soil. Not necessarily that it was all statistically significant, but it was a lot more carbon. And that was also pretty clear in the CN ratio of the organic matter, telling us that indeed this is less decomposed, more fresher, if you will, organic matter that was accumulating even in deep soil layers. Didn't really think, as I said, this was very, very significant at the time when we started out the work, but we were surprised because the implications actually extended to more than just percent carbon. I'm going to show you in a minute. But this was almost 15 years ago now. Fast forward 15 years ago, a recent graduate from my lab, Leila Wahab, went back and sampled the site 20 years after the experiment started. And 20 years after, and Leila's paper is actually all but accepted right now, is coming out in Biogeosciences any day now. She's addressing the final reviews. But so Leila's results were a little different than what we saw though. So if you remember, the amount of carbon in soil, especially at depth, was higher in the spring treatment plots, in the early part of the rainfall addition treatment. And that actually coincided with shifts in above ground vegetation that the ecologists in the study had observed towards more forbs. So the perennial grasses were being replaced by forbs and nitrogen fixing forbs in particular, which was an interesting thing, annuals that occurred. So we had explained the results using those kind of explanations, basically shifts above ground vegetation. But now, 20 years later, 15 years after the samples that I collected, when Leila collected her samples, there was a higher carbon, not in the spring, but in the winter treatment plots. And that was interesting, but in many ways kind of explains, I think the explanation is a little bit more different than we initially probably hypothesized.
So I also want to show you kind of what the depth profile of carbon stock looks like in soil. So remember, these are soils that are very deep. In the beginning, you know, when I was doing the experiment, we only sampled until 50 centimeters because there's a kind of trade-off that we have to maintain between collecting the samples that we need and maintaining the integrity of the experiment for 20 years. So taking a geoprobe to sample up to 3 meters at the time was a no-no. But 20 years, the experiment was being dismantled, so we can take geoprobes, take deep soil samples. So now we're going 3 meters below the surface to quantify where is the change in carbon that being observed. And interestingly, at depth, some of those changes that we observed early persisted, but only about 150 centimeters. Below that, at least in this kind of zone right here between 200 to 150, didn't necessarily persist in the spring, but overall there was this significant change that occurred, especially in the surface layers, especially when you compare control and spring, right? That was quite a shift that occurred in 15 years. And one of the things that made us that we had to think about in this, trying to explain this results then, is think about what happens. You know, it's one thing to think about short-term patterns like we did in the 2012 paper, but now we have to factor in not only is there different amount of biomass and different types of biomass, but the biomass is decomposing under very different conditions, right? Not only is in the spring there is more biomass, but the conditions are also better for decomposition in late spring and summer, right? So potentially speaking, what is happening here is that even though there was higher plant productivity that we had observed in the spring, the conditions under the additional water basically made it more conducive for microbes to decompose this organic matter, because now it's not bone dry in the late spring and summer. It's actually wet. It's wet, microbes can thrive, and they can continue to break down the organic matter. But in the winter, interestingly, it's already wet, but now it's even wetter. So the residue, the biomass, is presumably not, it looks like it wasn't decomposing efficiently, at least on the surface, and so it accumulated significantly in the surface layers. Either way, that kind of pattern is a kind of interesting change that occurred. And these are kind of compiled the data in 50 centimeter increments, but the data actually is very detailed every 10 centimeters. So it's a pretty rich data set that Leila collected. Okay, so the other part of the story in what's going on in Mendocino is the fact that you have to think about the fact that these are very well-developed soil, have, relatively speaking, a bit more iron oxides, not just organic matter. And organic, iron oxides are these interesting species in soil. They are products of extensive biogeochemical weathering, and they occur in soils that have basically undergone quite significant transformations, chemically speaking. And iron oxides, there's countless studies now to demonstrate that they play disproportionately high role in terms of regulating organic matter dynamics, largely because they have very high specific surface area that allows organic compounds to absorb onto their surfaces, or allow for aggregates to form to protect organic matter from decomposition. And because they're very small, right, typically speaking in the nano-size range, they're very susceptible to redistribution. They're also iron oxides, meaning they're redox sensitive. So when you have soils that remain wet for a long period of time, there is redox fluctuations. And what many people have shown at this point is that when there are a lot of oxides in soil and they can absorb organic matter into their surfaces, if you have change in precipitation that induces change in redox conditions, it could actually destabilize that association. It could make organic matter or carbon that was stabilized because of its mineral association, render it decomposable or to loss with dissolution and distribution in the soil system. And when that happens then, if that organic matter is freed from that chemical association with minerals, then it could be lost to decomposition or leaching. Okay, so in the 2012 paper, we did very simple correlations to demonstrate how carbon storage in soil was correlated with stock of different types of iron aluminum oxyhydroxides. So that what these notifications are basically is just showing is the first part is dithiazide extractable iron, which is heterogenic iron that accumulates in soil. These two iron aluminum oxyhydroxides that have pi are pyrophosphate extractable iron aluminum hydroxides, and those are typically metals that are complex with organic matter. And these are iron aluminum oxides that are poorly crystalline in soil, and so poorly crystalline species that have high specific surface area. And one thing that was interesting when we looked at this, first of all, the R square values here are pretty simple, low for most of them because there's high variability in the soil. But one thing that we'll notice is that if you look at the control and the spraying, the associations in particular with heterogenic iron and the poorly crystalline species are actually statistically significant. They are not generally in pyrophosphate extractable pool, partly because there's very little of it in these soils. But if you notice, the winter is an odd one out in this case, right? And what it does demonstrate then is that these soils that are already wet, remaining even wetter during the winter period, at least in this annual time scale that we're looking at, had caused the loss of that association organic matter had, or at least it was starting to show evidence that that could potentially be vulnerable to loss, this association of organic matter and metals. So we went ahead and investigated this in the 20-year samples too, now including the, kind of the larger set of samples that we have. And you're seeing, again, kind of in the control treatment, in all cases for carbon and nitrogen in 20 years, you see a positive association of carbon and nitrogen with the metal oxides, in particular the poorly crystalline iron and aluminum. But in all cases, the control and winter treatment plots, not just the winter at this point, but both of them, actually see a negative association, right? So the longer this rainfall addition experiment, the longer this disruption to precipitation happened, the loss that you're seeing of the positive association, or at least the neutral association that you had here with nitrogen and polycrystalline aluminum, all of that disappears, and you're seeing a negative turn. And this is actually quite worrisome because these are the mechanisms that are responsible for long-term accumulation of carbon and nitrogen in soil. So what this is showing is that the precipitation disruption is affecting that in a major way. Okay. Let's go slightly different again in high elevation systems in the Sierra Nevada. And I'm talking about meadow ecosystems in the Sierra Nevada in particular, because meadows are incredibly important in this ecosystem. They're what we call our water towers, right? The snow that falls on top of the mountains is quite significant in terms of how it regulates water flow with snow melt and filtering of that water and flood attenuation that occurs in downhill communities. And it's also very, very important for carbon sequestration, because carbon does, plants photosynthesize and carbon accumulates in these soils over winter periods, but they mainly stay cold for a big part of the year. And so carbon does not decompose as efficiently, and hence all of these meadow soils some of them are actually peat. They have a lot of carbon that accumulates in these soils. And so in particular, we went to two sites. One is on the Yosemite National Park site, Dana Meadow, and the other one is right on the crest of the Sierra on the other side at the Inyo National Forest at the Harvey Monroe Hall RNA. And at both of these sites, we investigated a bunch of things, and I'll just show you a few results. And the reason why we went there in the first place is because this is data that the historic data that was recorded for snow water equivalent at Yosemite. And what was going on at the time was that we went from a shift, there's fluctuations in precipitation, 1 standard deviation as marked by these lines is pretty common. But then you had 2011, which is a record wet year, one of the record wet years that occurred on this, the 7th wettest on the record occurred. It was followed by 2012 immediately, which was the 5th driest year on record, and then went on to 2013, which at the time was the driest year on record. So the ecosystem saw quite a significant swing, one of the most significant swings downward in terms of drying that the system had seen. And just to give you a comparison, when we started working in these sites in Yosemite in 2011, March looked like that. versus 2013, pretty dry. And then when you go back, fast forward to August in both of these systems, very different, right? It was extremely dry year, 2013 in this ecosystem. And what does that mean for soils? Like the soils that normally in August that would still be fairly saturated, had a lot of water, organic matter is pretty rich and visible, now are not just dry, but they're experiencing desiccation because of the intense drying that occurred. So we were looking at the implication of that. And to do that, then we wanted a systematic kind of area to study the questions that we were asking. So we went to the meadows, and in each of these meadows, we classified different parts of the meadow based on their hydrology. And you might recall from your early geomorphology or geography classes that, of course, hydrology in these kind of systems is largely dictated by geomorphology. So the shape of the topography of the landscape, where water is flowing will dictate. Some of the parts of the meadow will stay wetter than others. There's typically gradients. And so we identified this gradient that occurs from dry to intermediate to wet. And thankfully, in these kinds of systems, the vegetation associations tell you very clearly about where these gradients are. It's a pretty well-established kind of system. And so we collected samples from each of these areas across multiple repeated sites to do a whole bunch of analysis, and also installed sensors to quantify carbon fluxes and other things. And one of the kind of important results that came out of the work that we did was a measurement of the vertical carbon fluxes that occur in this ecosystem. So how did it change from 2011, 12, 13, considering the dry, intermediate, and wet periods? So when we had a pretty wet year, plant productivity was high, as you would expect. It kind of dried as this went. But the opposite happens to CO2 flux. This is mean cumulative flux that occurred during the growing season at this point. So as you see, it gets higher, and also it gets higher from dry, intermediate, wet. When all is said and done, we found out that above ground net primary productivity decreased by 39% from 2011 to 2013. So that extreme shift. But mean CO2 flux, though, during the growing season increased by 100%. So a double whammy, if you will, for the carbon loss in that ecosystem. Further on, we tried to think about, okay, what happened to the soil in terms of the desiccation, and what is its implication? And so there's this really well-established principle in soil mechanics that relates the soil's kind of structural integrity, if you will, with how much water is lost, and how fast and how dry and how fast it dries these soils. And the reason is because when you have capillary suction or water just being drained out of the soil system, the reality is, of course, you're going to have hydraulic conductivity also respond to that. But you also, in these kinds of soils where so much of the microporosity is actually supported by organic matter, you have physical collapse of these soils. So they're not just desiccating because organic matter is going to decompose, but also because physically that suction collapses those pore spaces. And that has implication for hydraulic conductivity and permeability. And what we saw actually was that there was an irreversible loss of 6% of soil volume during those 2 years. And largely because this was lost in macropores in soil, which meant there were more meso and micropores, so smaller pores instead of larger pores that could hold even more water in the system that had a lot of organic matter. There was also an overall a decrease in water holding capacity and loss of water. You were going to say something.
Is irreversible forever, or is it for the time scale of the ecology of the meadow?
So as far as the soil mechanics is concerned, there does not seem to be an easy way to reverse it unless you just build more and more organic matter on top.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's a pretty intense kind of change in that ecosystem that's occurring. Think about it in this way. And I really like this metaphor because, as quirky as it is, I think it gets the message across, right? You have extreme drying that happened rather quickly, right? If you think about it as a grape, you could dry it to a raisin, but even if you stick that raisin into water, you're not easily going to bring it back to its plumb state. That's kind of basically what the soil is experiencing. And unfortunately, it had quite significant implications for all sorts of things, including the fact that now you don't have enough water holding capacity, what that means in these kinds of ecosystems is now water is going to drain laterally, so a lot more intense flash flood events instead of slow release of the water, kind of laterally that would have occurred in the subsurface. There's even faster decomposition of organic matter in these carbon-rich soils, also really important. We did a whole bunch of studies to think about how fast carbon decomposition is occurring and think about the mechanisms that are guiding that. This is results from a set of incubation experiments that Chelsea Arnold, who was our student, many years ago now, a decade ago, did to just demonstrate. So what we did in this experiment is we got the soils from all those sites that I mentioned, replicate site, dry, intermediate, wet. And then we subjected the soils to different water potentials, ranging from very wet to very, very dry. And then observed how much CO2 was released in those experiments. And these were done at 3 different depths. So the black one is the surface in all cases, red is intermediate, 10 to 20, and blue is in the deepest layer. We investigated 20 to 40. Most of these soils did not extend below that, so this kind of was the deepest we could get. But the interesting pattern to me is here. In particular, this kind of U curve that's more pronounced in some of them than others. So when you account for, so CO, I should take a step back. When you do decomposition experiments and you collect CO2 fluxes, you can then calculate the amount of carbon that was in the active pool, meaning the one that is easily decomposable by microbes. So this is the pool that is accessible for rather short-term decomposition of organic matter. Labile carbon sometimes is called, or the active carbon. So that you get by just fitting this simple exponential model into the data of CO2 flux over time. And when you plot that for these different sites, you end up with this U curve, which is kind of weird, right? Because if you thought about wetting and drying, we expected it to be doing different things, right? Wetting, of course, caused that connection that we mentioned, and initially can increase rate of decomposition. But we thought maybe drying would not do that, except that assumption did not factor in the consolidation that I talked about, the loss in microporosity and how the soils actually shrunk. In that case, then, that connection that was broken between the water, the microbes, and the decomposing organic matter, because the soils came, kind of the macroporosity collapsed, those all of a sudden are now close to one another. So they could still continue to decompose. And it turned out that that uptick in CO2 and the amount of CO that we see here is explained by that. And you can also see similar patterns in the ratio of the active, the ratio of the initially labile pool to the active, total active pool that you expect in soils like this. And this is just representing the rate of the decay rate constant for these soils. Obviously higher in the surface than it is in deeper soil layers, but quite an interesting pattern that we did not really necessarily appreciate until doing this work, and consolidated this in this kind of model to demonstrate. So the drying-induced consolidation and loss of value in this case is doing very, very important role here in having, kind of exposing, if you will, this pool of carbon, the pool B, that would have been exposed to decomposition, is now all of a sudden being exposed to even more decomposition because the soils got collapsed and the loss of microporosity and shrinking when you lost the water brought everything into closer pattern with one another. And when applying a two-pool of organic matter that is accessible, so the one pool that is accessible under wetter conditions versus the pool B that's accessible at drier conditions, after the soil consolidates, after the loss of macroporosity, we see why that effective rate of kind of decomposition, or the effective size of the active pool, looks more like this U pattern that is now represented by the black lines, as opposed to one you would have expected that would have mirrored the pool A. So we can talk about a lot more about this if it's an interest later. And I will quickly just mention this other work that we did in the southern Sierra Nevada of what is the implication of all the changing precipitation patterns, in particular on lateral transport. And this work was done as part of the Southern Sierra Critical Zone Observatory that NSF funded over many years. And former students, Emma and Aaron Stacy did this work. And what we did here was we went through 8 catchments. These are all 8 catchments in the southern Sierra Nevada, in a place called Crew or Kings River Experimental Watershed. Once these 4 are in a high elevation system that we collectively refer to as Bull, these are all in a lower elevation system that we call Providence, which is the names of these things in the nearby areas. What is significant here is that in Providence, both these sites have relatively similar precipitation amounts, but their distribution is different. In Bull, main form of precipitation is snow. In Providence, it's rain and snow kind of mix. And these sites were selected the way they are as a way of kind of testing a hypothesis about changing climate. What happens if the climate in this environment changes? And the precipitation patterns, especially in high elevation systems, change from being mainly driven by snow to rain and snow mixture. And there were a whole bunch of work that we did as part of the Sierra Nevada, but today I was just going to tell you about kind of the implication, if you will, of what we saw in terms of the nature of the material that was laterally transported. And we monitored across many geomorphic regions, in particular these 3 that were common across many of the catchments that we submitted, that we sampled, and then sediment basins. Each of these catchments were fitted with sediment basins, which allowed all the sediment that eroded from the entire catchment on an annual basis was cleared. The mass was recorded. All sorts of measurements were taken to account for how changes in precipitation and other climate variables were affecting lateral transport. This work has implications beyond just carbon cycling, because it's also a way to think about, as climate shifts, what is going to be entering streams and our waterways and reservoirs, which is a really important set of questions for municipal leaders and people who lead water services for communities, large cities and others. So the only kind of data I'm going to show you here is the 15N and 13C composition of the sediments that were collected at the bottom, so here at the sediment basins. Compare that to the source where in the catchments the sediment came from. And so what we see, kind of here basically is that the sediments are from multiple years, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. Remember, 11, 12, 13 are the same years that you saw in the other. 11 was pretty wet, 13 was very, very dry. That was true across the Sierra Nevada ecosystems. And 13C is used here as a way of tracing the source of the organic matter. Where is it coming from? And 15N especially is used as a way of tracing how processed is the organic matter. So in leaf, I would expect way less enriched 15N value, because the nitrogen just hasn't seen enough transformations. But the more decomposed, the more processed the organic matter is, the 15N should be enriched. And so as you see the data here, what becomes clear is that most of the carbon that's eroded in those blue, right, especially in those blue here, that enters the sediment basins, is derived from forest floor material. Composition-wise, it's much closer to the green than there is to the sediments that are up in the hill. That makes a lot of sense. These are steep hill slopes in forested catchments where there is a lot of organic matter that every year enters the forest floor. So if water is flowing on the surface, it's going to take a lot of that material, right? That makes sense. But we do see important differences in the composition of eroded organic matter with precipitation. In particular, for example, if you saw, so the 2011, the wet year, right? Pretty similar to vegetation in both cases. But the more kind of slightly processed organic matter that you see here in drier years, even the sediment that still resembles plants is more kind of enriched than the plant material, and starting to look more and more towards the kind of mix between the plant material and the sediments, the soils from the hill slopes. And what that says basically is that in really wet years, right, in wet years, there's a lot of water that just, kind of washes everything out of the catchments. And even in terms of, kind of these years, you have so much organic matter that's flowing with the force of the water that's carrying it. But in dry years, In dry years, water doesn't do that as much because some of it sips into the soil and slowly moves in the landscape. And so less and less of that less and less of the material that's moved in dry years actually looks like just the vegetation signature, but actually bears the soil organic matter signature. And kind of to summarize this, you could think about it in terms of like when you have low precipitation material, right? A lot of just the plant material derived from particulate organic matter, high carbon, less enriched in terms of isotopes. But in deeper soil layers, when you have high precipitation events that can mobilize so much mass, then not only can they take that plant-derived organic matter, but also more processed organic matter, more older organic matter, more organic matter that's associated with minerals. So with that, I will kind of wrap up and hopefully give us a few more minutes to chat and for folks to ask questions. But the message here is that I hope I've convinced you that biogeochemical responses to changing precipitation regimes are quite highly dependent on, first of all, what kind of change we're talking about in precipitation and how big of that change is. And we've seen discussions, for example, from the results on decrease in precipitation that causes drop in net primary productivity, while at the same time showing increased rates of decomposition, soil desiccation, and compaction, especially the evidence from the high elevation systems in Sierra Nevada. We've also seen that when increase in precipitation, like what happened in Mendocino, not just changed amount of carbon stored in soil, but also the mechanisms that are responsible for soil organic matter, especially the oxide organic matter associations. And I think the other really important lesson is that those fluctuations from extremely wet to extremely dry conditions with a rather short period of time that we saw in the high elevation systems in California caused quite a significant loss of carbon from these really carbon-rich ecosystems, quite significantly leading to quite a widespread meadow degradation, loss of ecosystem services that communities downstream receive from these meadows, including potential loss of soil water storage, modulating hydrologic flows for low elevation systems that happen. And what we've seen in that kind of irreversible loss of macroporosity is that one or two extreme seasons could significantly change ecosystems for generations, if not longer. And of course, not to mention the fact that there are interactive effects of changing precipitation patterns on organic matter amount, chemistry, mineral associations, soil structure, and a variety of other variables that are happening in these ecosystems. So precipitation obviously changing, even small changes in precipitation, we've seen across all sorts of ecosystems that you've seen to have very, very important change. With that, I'll stop, and hopefully we still have a good amount of time for questions. Great. Through a lot kind of really fast, so by all means stop me and ask me to go back if you want me to.
Deep dive into biogeochemistry, which I like to always try to convince my atmosphere and ocean science colleagues biology is as important as the rest of your chemistry and physics that you think about all day. All right, questions? Students, yeah. Go ahead.
Very interesting talk. I have two questions, if I can ask two. One is that in your first set of experiments where you had those sites and the sprinkling experiments of precipitation, how do you account for the ambient precipitation happening in that region, which would be homogeneous across all the sites, but there might be seasonality to it between winter and spring? Do you account for the mean precipitation at all?
Oh, yeah, I mean, obviously, we're not counting for so much of the variability. It's just, we collect the precipitation in the winter, and 20% is just applied in a very uniform manner using these sprinklers in one set of plots, and 20% above ambient in the other set of plots. But there's not a whole lot of kind of variability that is introduced. It's as simple as it's gonna get. Yeah.
And my second question was going to be that as the climate changes and we might expect the winter to be potentially have more spring-like behavior, would you suggest that the soil would also change its liquid shift, or would it shift?
I mean, I think a lot of the climate change experiments that are, especially the ecosystem experiments that are set up with that premise. This one was unique because it actually tried to increase precipitation instead of decrease. Because so much of the other available experiments are drought. And the kind of experiments where you're seeing, you're expecting at least lower precipitation, they see lower plant productivity, they see loss of carbon over periods of time. I think that's been observed in multiple different types of experiments. I want to be clear though, right? Nobody is saying these types of experiments are perfect representations of the world. They're just practical ways that we can study the implications of change. The one, kind of critique of this kind of approach that I will give you myself is applying 20% above precipitation, is that really changing rainfall? Right? Because a lot of things change in the ecosystem when precipitation is occurring. We're not able to mimic that. We can't do that. This is just a very realistic approximation of what are we expecting this system's going to do when it sees more water than less water, kind of thing. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good questions. John?
Really fascinating. I don't know anything about what you're talking about, but you invited us in. I thank you for that. One of the things that I'm left with wondering is the alpine meadow environment so sensitive to that extreme? And here's why I say this. Because one presumes that this is a fairly stable ecosystem on the very broadest scales. I can't imagine that we've never had such a big fluctuation in precipitation one year to the next. So what are some things in the ecosystem that perhaps are not well understood yet, or that are understood and didn't make it into your talk, that help to equilibrate under conditions like this? Because look at 1964 to 65 had another giant swing. This seems like it's believably part of the natural variability. So how does the system maintain some sense of stability?
Maybe what's not clear is that this is the jump up, right?
Mm-hmm.
As is this one. This is down. That downward drying, that extreme drying, this was actually the most extreme the system had seen in recorded history.
Yeah, so it's a vector. It's not just a scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So the direction matters in this case, and
Okay.
especially when we're thinking about things like that, a reversible change in microporosity.
Yeah.
Because think about how porosity is built in soil over long periods of time, and it's really a balance of how much of this fluctuation a system has seen. And in the soil mechanics principle that actually underlie this work that I mentioned, this work. This is actually a beautiful paper for those of you who might be interested in this work. This is a soil physics paper. And the mechanics calculation, so they go through the history of the foundations of why this is. And the reality is the more extreme fluctuation a system sees as the soil is developing, the more it's accustomed to these changes. And so it won't react necessarily abruptly. But if a system is seeing fluctuations beyond where it had seen historically, then it can have this kind of catastrophic change that moves it away from anything that it can rebound from, at least within any perceivable time frame that anybody has been able to observe or model. Hence why it's discussed as this irreversible change in porosity. It doesn't mean that the system will never be able to regain 6% soil volume. It just means it has to have a lot more new soil and organic matter that has to come on top now, or from roots growing in the soil. And that's a very different process than actually being able to recover it just because the water comes back.
Okay. And are there intra-seasonal periods so the distribution of precipitation in a season, even in a wet season, how much does that affect this exact same process?
They did a whole bunch of lab experiments to actually, this is where these cores that were collected, they put them in a setup in the lab to get them to fluctuate in different time points. And it doesn't actually take that long for this change to occur. It's just a matter of the magnitude of change.
Okay.
How fast water drains is what it appears to be in these kinds of systems.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Going back to your first study, I think it's really cool to see such a long-lasting study like that. And you were basing it off of models that had different answers for what might future precipitation look like. Do we have any idea over the 20 or 25 years since those models were run what has actually happened? And could you see that over the course of the experiment, did that have an effect on what you were looking at?
Yeah, so initially when this experiment was set up, there were a lot of people that were scratching their heads. It's like, are you sure this is a worthwhile experiment to do? It's like most places are expected to get dry. Increasing precipitation seems to be, and I'm actually glad that Blake Suttle, who was the person responsible for setting up this experiment, I'm glad he stuck it out and he went on to do this work for 20 years. But it turns out, yeah, it came right. The increased precipitation in California did occur, especially in northern part of California, which is where this study took place pretty high north in California, right, in Mendocino, California. It's pretty wet already, and it's also seeing a lot of water. But it's seeing a lot of water, generally speaking, but punctuated by periods of extremely dry climates, weather events. And so that is a tricky, it's like overall, yes, it has increased, but there has also been periods of extremely dry, and that has even had, things I'm sure you've heard discussed in terms of implication for fire and other things in this system and many other systems in places like California.
Yeah, it gets me thinking because, obviously there's all sorts of variabilities happening in the atmosphere to drive climate trends in these models. But a side of this, right, is you just demonstrated that soil physics are changing with time as a function of these changes in precipitation dynamics. And that's not something that's typically modeled in either weather or climate Earth system models, right? But there could be feedbacks, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know, what would be a take home in terms of somebody who is developing an Earth system model? Like, if they wanted to more realistically include soil physics, what would be to get the carbon cycle right, which is then going to feed back into the future climate? What, like, is there a way to, is there something that would be really useful to, because most of the time things like porosity, texture, those are fixed parameters in those models, right? And so
Yeah.
what would you do?
I think soil structure would be one that I would capture. Is one that is hardly ever captured in any kind of modeling framework. Not just the atmospheric models, but even some of the soil carbon models have a hard time with dealing with soil structure. Part of it is because it's a pretty dynamic property that's also very hard to measure, right? Soil structure means different things when you're looking at a soil that I just grabbed out of the soil versus an intact soil while it's inside the profile. Before I disturb it and after I disturb it, they mean two different things, right? And so it's a pretty hard thing to quantify, something that we still have not grappled with, but it regulates a lot of things, including things like bulk density that determines how much actually carbon are we talking about in soil. It depends a lot on how compacted the soil is, but we have no way of kind of capturing that so far. It's a major variable that people in the world of, especially in this intersection of soil physics and biogeochemistry. I happen to be married to one, so I hear.
Just kind of trying to bring home too some of the folks here who think more about weather processes, like. That has an impact on like the evapotranspiration functions.
Big
It has
time.
things on like
Yeah.
an atmospheric feedbacks to convection, right? Like if you don't get like soil compaction right, which is not in any weather model. So there's some really cool questions I think that are still open.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Other questions from the audience? A couple minutes to come.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, first of all, really interesting talk. I was wondering, if you go to that slide where you have the pool A and pool B rules, I was wondering if, I might have missed this, but is there an increase in decomposition with increase in dryness for one of the pools? I think it was pool B. There's like
So,
or is that
yeah.
not what that was?
So the pool B increased in decomposition because that's the pool of carbon that I said was not really accessible before. Because if you look at it in this, I know I went through this super fast. So the pool A of carbon is now the carbon that is, inside the big clods, if you will, the big pieces of soils and aggregates. The pool B is this one. The more compacted the soil is, the more you get to access that pool B. Right, instead of just the majority of the carbon that was in pool A. And this is just kind of trying for simplicity to kind of categorize them into hypothetical pools, right? But the idea here is that the more you compress that soil, the more you start, accessing this pool B, which maybe presumably before may not have been as accessible. And if you think about, kind of what's happening here, then the easily accessible carbon that is in the pool A, that's going to be decomposing
that's going to be what decomposes as the soil dries. But as soon as the soil is really, really dry and starts consolidating, then you get, relatively speaking, more pool B than A starting to be accessed, right? More and more of that pool B becomes accessible, only under dry conditions. Because until you're dry, it's just disconnected from the microbes, and the carbon and the water are disconnected, and they are not able to be to decompose it efficiently. Not because the carbon is not there, it's just because it's not connected. But now all of a sudden you collapse those soil, and they come in contact and are efficiently.
It's not accessible.
The little water that remains is now more in contact with the remaining microbes, and potentially can fuel the decomposition of whatever organic matter you might have there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So in reality, both pools decompose, but this one, the easily accessible pool, as the soil dries, you have less and less of that. But as the soil dries, this pool that would not have been accessible starts, more and more of that starts decomposing, effectively leading to that kind of U shape that we saw in some of the data.
Did you want a quick follow-up?
Yeah, because it's really interesting. There's got to be a limit, though, to how dry the soil can. If you get
Oh, yeah.
past a certain dryness, everything stops, right?
Microbes cannot function.
Okay, that's really interesting.
That's- yeah.
Okay, I get that better than I did the first time.
Different microbes, right?
Yeah. Different types of microbes.
Yeah.
I mean, P.S. here.
That's the other side, right, the
Yeah.
microbiology. Yeah. But we're past our time, so we should let Asmeret give us another, we'll give her another hand, and